The farmhouse smelled of blood and antiseptic, a combination that had become almost normal to Private Daniel Worthen by the third week of November 1944. He knelt beside a stretcher, fingers steady as he adjusted the plasma line feeding into the arm of a lieutenant whose name he didn't know. The man's breathing was shallow, labored, each exhale accompanied by a wet rattle that signaled fluid in the lungs. Outside, the Belgian countryside had gone silent in that unnatural way that preceded something terrible. Worthen had learned to recognize that silence. The aid station wasn't supposed to be here. Not this far forward, not this exposed. 3 miles behind the line, that's where battalion had told them to set up. But the line had moved or dissolved, or simply ceased to exist in any meaningful sense. What Worthen knew for certain was this: 9 medics, 6 wounded men, and a half-collapsed farmhouse with canvas tarps stretched across beams that groaned whenever the wind picked up. Sergeant Callahan stood near the doorway, peering into the gray afternoon light, his rifle slung across his back in a way that suggested he expected to use it. The radio had been intermittent all morning, crackling with fragments of distant voices before fading into static. The last convoy hadn't arrived. 2 men had been sent to scout the perimeter an hour ago and hadn't returned. Worthen secured the plasma line and stood, his knees aching from the cold stone floor. That's when he heard it, distant at first, but growing louder. Engines. Not American engines. The sound was different, deeper, more guttural. German. Callahan heard it too. His shoulders tensed, and without a word, he moved to the western window, motioning for the others to stay low. Worthen's chest tightened. He glanced at the wounded men behind him, at their pale faces and bandaged limbs, and understood with perfect clarity that something had gone very wrong. The front line had collapsed around them, and no one had thought to tell the medics. They were alone now, and the enemy was coming closer. The Germans arrived with the efficiency of men who had done this many times before. Worthen watched through a gap in the canvas as 2 armored cars rolled into view, followed by infantry moving in a loose skirmish line through the trees. They weren't charging. They were methodical, cautious, sweeping the woods and cutting off the road that led back to American lines. Within minutes, the perimeter was sealed. Callahan moved through the farmhouse quickly, his voice low and controlled. Extinguish the lanterns. Stay quiet. Prepare to move the wounded. But even as he gave the orders, Worthen could see the calculation happening behind the older man's eyes. There were 6 wounded men, 3 on stretchers, 2 barely conscious. Moving them would take time they didn't have. The Germans were already too close. Callahan stopped in the center of the room, his jaw working as he weighed options that all seemed impossible. Surrender meant abandoning the wounded to an uncertain fate. Scattering meant leaving men to die. Holding meant turning medics into combatants. Worthen watched the decision settle over Callahan's face like a mask. They would hold. They would give the wounded every possible chance. Worthen looked at the men on the stretchers. The lieutenant with the sucking chest wound, his bandages soaked through. The rifleman with the shattered leg, bone fragments visible through torn flesh. The driver who hadn't opened his eyes in hours. These weren't abstractions or tactical considerations. They were breathing human beings whose survival depended on what happened in the next few hours. Worthen picked up his rifle, a weapon he had fired exactly twice since arriving in Europe, both times at targets during training, and moved to the northern window. His hands were steady, but his stomach churned. Outside, voices drifted through the trees. German voices. Close. Too close. Someone laughed, the sound sharp and incongruous. Then silence again. They were testing the perimeter, probing for weakness. Worthen's finger rested on the trigger guard, and he realized with a cold, creeping certainty that the rules had changed. Geneva Conventions and Red Crosses meant nothing here. They were surrounded, cut off, and alone. The German voice came from the darkness, fractured English carried on the cold November air. American medics. You will surrender now. No harm to you. Callahan stood near the doorway, his silhouette barely visible against the fading light. His response was immediate and final. No, the single word hung in the air for a heartbeat, and then the world exploded into noise. Muzzle flashes lit the tree line, bullets snapping through the canvas and punching holes in the farmhouse walls. Worthen fired without thinking, 3 quick shots toward movement in the woods. The recoil jolted his shoulder. Someone screamed. He couldn't tell if it was German or American. The firefight lasted less than a minute, sharp and disorienting, and then it was over. 1 German soldier lay motionless in the clearing. The rest had pulled back into the trees. Worthen's ears rang in the sudden silence. His hands shook as he lowered the rifle. Behind him, one of the wounded men was crying, a soft, continuous sound that cut through the ringing. Worthen turned and saw the lieutenant's plasma line torn loose, blood pooling on the stretcher. He dropped to his knees, forcing his hands to steady as he reinserted the catheter. The plasma began flowing again, clear fluid chasing away the blood. Callahan was speaking, checking the others, but Worthen couldn't focus on the words. He stared at his hands, at the blood on his fingers, and felt something fundamental shift inside him. He had crossed a line that wasn't supposed to exist. Medics were non-combatants, protected under international law, marked with red crosses precisely because they were healers, not killers. But the law had evaporated the moment those bullets started flying. Callahan's voice cut through the fog. "Check the radio." Worthen moved to the damaged equipment, his hands working automatically. Shattered. The case was cracked, wiring exposed, static hissing weakly before fading to nothing. They couldn't call for help. No one knew where they were. The nearest American unit was somewhere to the west, but distance had become meaningless. Outside, the Germans were regrouping. Worthen could hear them moving through the underbrush, voices low and deliberate. They would attack again. It was only a question of when. He returned to the window, rifle in hand, and felt the weight of what he had become. Not a medic. Not a soldier. Something in between, defined by necessity and isolated by circumstance. The stakes were no longer theoretical. They were existential. Dawn came slowly, gray light filtering through the gaps in the walls, and with it came the Germans. Worthen saw them first, shadows moving with purpose through the trees, more organized than before, flanking positions established, suppressing fire coordinated. This wasn't a probe. This was an assault. He fired, the rifle bucking against his shoulder, and watched a figure drop. Reload. Fire again. Behind him, the wounded men lay on stretchers, some crying out, some silent in a way that might have been unconsciousness or resignation. Time stretched and compressed. 14 minutes, though Worthen wouldn't know that until much later. 14 minutes that felt like drowning. The Germans came in waves, methodical and patient, using cover and suppressing fire to advance. Worthen moved between positions, firing from the northern window, then the eastern doorway, conserving ammunition because there was no resupply coming. His shoulder burned where a bullet had grazed him, blood soaking through his uniform, but he kept moving. One of the other medics, Harper from Ohio, was hit in the chest and went down without a sound. Worthen dragged him back, checked for a pulse, found nothing. No time to process. The Germans were trying to flank. He fired again, 3 controlled bursts, and saw movement cease. The wounded rifleman on the stretcher was screaming now, his shattered leg jostled during the chaos. Worthen grabbed a morphine syringe, jammed it into the man's thigh, and returned to the window. Reload. Fire. The wall beside him exploded inward, splinters and dust filling the air. He threw himself flat, ears ringing, then scrambled to drag the lieutenant's stretcher away from the collapsing section of wall. The plasma line held. Small miracle. He returned fire through the new hole, saw a German soldier stumble back. The assault faltered. The Germans pulled back again, confused or cautious or simply reassessing. 14 minutes. Smoke hung in the air, acrid and thick. Spent shell casings littered the floor. Worthen sat against the wall, rifle across his lap, staring at his hands. They were covered in blood, some his own, some from the wounded, some from men he had shot. He had saved lives and taken lives in the same span of time, and the moral equation didn't balance. It couldn't balance. His chest heaved, lungs burning, and he realized he was crying without sound. No one spoke. The silence was absolute except for labored breathing and the distant sound of engines retreating. The Germans withdrew sometime after noon, their reasons unknowable. Perhaps they had spotted American reinforcements approaching. Perhaps the cost had simply grown too high for what they thought was a minor target. Worthen didn't care why. He only knew that the firing had stopped and the woods had gone silent again, this time without the promise of violence. He tended to the surviving medics first, one with a leg wound, another with shrapnel in his back, then returned to the stretchers. The lieutenant was still breathing barely. The rifleman had passed out from the morphine. The driver hadn't moved. Worthen checked his pulse and found nothing. Another body to add to the count. An American patrol arrived late that afternoon, faces shocked when they saw the farmhouse still standing, still occupied. They moved quickly, loading the wounded onto jeeps, wrapping the dead in canvas. Worthen answered questions mechanically, his voice flat and distant. Yes, they held the position. Yes, there were casualties. Yes, they engaged the enemy. A captain took notes, his expression unreadable. The medics were debriefed separately, each account adding to a picture that didn't quite fit the established rules. Medics weren't supposed to fight. But they had. Callahan defended the decision with the same quiet intensity he brought to everything, his arguments pragmatic and unapologetic. Worthen said less. He couldn't find words for what he felt. He had saved 6 men, 6 wounded soldiers who would have died if the aid station had been overrun. But he had killed at least 2 Germans, maybe more. The arithmetic didn't resolve into clarity. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a contradiction, a violation of something he had believed was immutable. Reports were filed. Questions were raised at levels far above Worthen's understanding. Someone mentioned commendations. Worthen nodded and said nothing. Days passed, then weeks. The war moved on, indifferent to the farmhouse and the men who had held it. But the questions didn't go away. They rippled outward, reaching desks at battalion headquarters, Medical Corps Command, eventually the War Department itself. What do you do when the front line collapses and medics are the only ones left? Do you maintain doctrine or adapt to reality? The ambiguity lingered, unsolved and uncomfortable, but impossible to ignore. Worthen survived the war, though parts of him did not. He returned to Vermont in the spring of 1945, to green mountains and quiet roads that felt alien after months in Europe. He enrolled in medical school on the GI Bill, became a rural doctor, spent 40 years treating farmers and loggers and children with winter colds. He married, had 2 daughters, lived a life that looked ordinary from the outside. He rarely spoke of the war. When asked, he would say he had been a medic, nothing more. But his actions in that Belgian farmhouse, and the actions of others like him scattered across the European theater, had already begun reshaping military doctrine in ways he would never fully see. The Army Medical Corps quietly revised its training protocols. Medics received expanded weapons instruction, not as combatants but as defenders of last resort. Forward aid stations were redesigned with defensive perimeters in mind, fallback positions identified, evacuation routes planned with the assumption that lines could collapse without warning. The concept of the hardened aid post entered official planning documents, a recognition that modern war eroded the boundaries between roles and that survival sometimes demanded contradictions. Worthen's case became a study in military medical schools, analyzed not for heroism but for the uncomfortable truths it revealed. The Red Cross could not always protect. The Geneva Conventions could not always hold. Healers might be forced to kill in order to save. These were not lessons anyone wanted to teach, but they were lessons the war had made unavoidable. A photograph exists, taken decades later, of the farmhouse in Belgium. It's overgrown now, ivy creeping up the shattered walls, the roof long since collapsed. A small plaque was installed by Belgian locals in the 1980s, marking the site where 9 American medics held off a German assault and saved 6 wounded men. Worthen never visited. He saw the photograph once, in a veteran's newsletter, and set it aside without comment. The legacy wasn't his to claim. It belonged to the institution, to the doctrine rewritten in the aftermath, to the thousands of medics who came after and trained with the knowledge that sometimes the line between healer and soldier disappears. 14 minutes had changed how armies think about saving lives under fire. Not through glory or triumph, but through necessity and the sober acknowledgement that war respects no boundaries, not even the ones we draw around mercy.